Why hello there! You didn't think I'd given up on Chronturbo now, did you? Not a chance. Chronturbo Episode 1 began with the system's launch in October 1987 up through July 1988, and this episode will cover the rest of 1988, 13 games altogether. As before, most games are published by Hudson in Japan, with Namco chipping in a bit, but 4 new publishers will be introduced this episode, and they're not really the usual suspects, no Konami or Capcom yet, though we do have a port of a Capcom arcade game, so let's start in August 1988. First out the gate this episode is Namco, with their 4th PC Engine game, Pro Tennis World Court. Just as Pro Yaku World Stadium was a souped-up version of Famicom's Family Stadium, so is Pro Tennis a souped-up version of Family Tennis. It even has that typical rainbow logo that we've seen on the title screens of so many of their Famicom games. There are options for up to 4 players, and you can choose your character from a variety of players based on real tennis pros. Naturally, NEC released this in the US as World Court Tennis. It turns out to be a pretty darn good tennis game. I liked it better than Family Tennis. Graphically, the game is nothing special, but it does handle surprisingly well. The CPU opponents are pretty fast and normally don't make many unforced errors, so you'll have to try to force errors upon them. Pressing the D-pad while swinging the racket will control the direction of your shot, so you can often get in a good shot into your opponent's opposite corner. So far, this is pretty typical for a tennis game, but here's where it gets weird. On the main menu, there's a quest option. What does that do? Well, first of all, you have to select a name and gender, and then you'll find yourself dragged into an utterly ridiculous RPG-inspired single-person campaign. It seems some evil tennis players have taken over the tennis kingdom, and the king of tennis wants you to clear the whole mess up, which he refers to as a favor. One thing we've noticed in Chrontendo is that throughout 1987 and 1988, RPG elements have been introduced into every conceivable genre. Platformers, racing games, shoot-'em-ups, you name it. But still, Pro Tennis is surprisingly brazen in the way that it inserts tennis games into a Dragon Quest-style RPG world. So the king gives you some cash, which you'll need to buy equipment, better rackets and shoes and shirts. Walk around town and various NPCs will give you little bits of unhelpful advice. Most hilariously, one guy identifies the village that you start off in as Chicago. Yeah, the whole thing is done in a pretty tongue-in-cheek fashion. Out on the overworld, you'll encounter other tennis players and be challenged to matches. You can try to refuse, but unless you have expensive shirts, you'll be forced to play. And losing a game will send you back to the king, who will resurrect you and give you a bit more money. Now, it turns out Pro Tennis isn't really an RPG. You don't have any stats, experience points, and never gain any magic or special moves. Better equipment does make you hit the ball harder and run faster, but really, the whole quest thing is just sort of a clever way to introduce a single-player campaign into the game. Later, you'll find helpful items and be able to travel to new cities. The Enter 2 allows you to cross bodies of water, and you'll need it to get a special item that'll help you fight the final boss. You'll also need to collect pearls, which are found by defeating bosses that are holed up in various locations around the overworld. So yeah, sure, this is pretty silly, but it really is quite surprising to see something like this in a sports game. And while the execution is hardly perfect, I'm glad Namco decided to sort of switch up the tennis game formula a little bit. If there's one TurboGrafx game that'll live in infamy forever, it's this one, Majin Ayuden Wataru by Hudson. The title can mean either Devil Hero Wataru or Machine Hero Wataru. On one hand, this is a typical licensed game, not that different from Bakuman World, except that it was released in the US by NEC in 1989 under the name Keith Courage in Alpha Zones. Furthermore, it was the pack-in game for the TurboGrafx 16, thus making it one of the most well-known titles for the console, at least in the United States. The original version was based on an animated series that ran from 1988 to 1989 by the well-respected animation studio Sunrise. The game concerned a young kid who found himself warped into a weird magical world that was sort of video game inspired, as he had to make his way through a pyramid with multiple themed levels. The series is still fondly remembered today, even though it looks kind of creepy to me, the way everyone has that weird vacant look on their faces and their mouths hang open all the time. Now the story was completely altered for the US version, though none of the characters were. Supposedly, in the US version, this takes place on Earth after an alien invasion, though you would never know that strictly from playing the game. A promotional comic book was created to explain the backstory. So, Keith Courage greatly resembles Wonder Boy in Monsterland. You kill monsters, collect money, buy items from the guys in the shops. You can also buy healing or special weapons. That's weapon, actually singular, it's just one, called the bolt bombs. At the end of each surface level, you ride a rainbow to the underground section, but you are now suddenly equipped in a mech, which can move much faster than your human form. Actually a pretty cool transformation sequence there. While down here you can fire off your bolt bombs, which are just little projectiles. They aren't quite as impressive as the name sounds. One thing I do love is the enemies that are shaped like handguns. Now, watching this video should give you a pretty good idea of how the game operates. Your health is measured in these suspiciously Zelda-like hearts. When you lose all 3 hearts, the game is over, but thankfully you can take a lot of hits before you lose a heart, which is a good thing because you really can't completely avoid enemies. Your robot is too big and slow compared to the enemies to actually avoid contact with them. At the end of each level, you'll fight a boss battle, but your hearts don't refill automatically afterwards. You might end up having to buy a health refill from the shop on the overworld in the next level. One disconcerting thing is that when you transform back into human form, since you move much more slowly without the robot suit, after playing as the robot, it's kind of frustrating to suddenly be moving like at a tortoise's pace again. You also need to buy things like better swords and of course more bolt bombs, but money is a bit of an issue since enemies only drop money on the overworld, and even then it's very infrequent, and the only way you can really sort of afford to buy stuff is to grind for cash, especially in spots like this, where enemies will keep coming over and over again. Now aside from this, the game feels sort of repetitive and uninspired. I mean, granted, it looks pretty good and the music is decent, but tedium will probably set in before too long. And from time to time there will be some sort of aggravating platforming moments, like this strangely hard to accomplish section right here. You gotta jump over some disappearing platforms, but a stream of enemies keeps pushing you back, and I kept hitting my head on something. I wasn't even sure if it was like the gray platform or the green one that was causing all the trouble. The bottom line is Keith Courage was a less than stellar game and not really the ideal game to bundle with a console in the United States. In Japan it was just another game, but in the US became almost symbolic of the failure of the TurboGrafx 16, sort of as like some kind of proof that the system was doomed from the start. And there were far better games released so far, like R-Type, or a few of the games we'll see later this episode. As for Hudson, they seem to have learned some lessons about the 16-bit platformer, because they ended up publishing much better platforming games in the future, such as Bonk's Adventure. Alright, here's one of the most highly regarded early PC Engine games, Alien Crush. Normally when discussing this game, people mention the inspiration of Swiss artist H.R. Giger, but on the title screen we also see a direct lift from the Dutch artist M.C. Escher, namely his famous tessellated lizards. That said, Alien Crush really does owe a huge debt to H.R. Giger's designs, and specifically the Alien movies. In the menu you can choose the speed as well as one of two soundtracks. Alright, we'll fire her up here. And yes, Alien Crush is a pinball game developed by none other than Compile, the first Compile game for the PC Engine. In terms of overall game design, it's pretty standard. Has the typical double-screen layout seen in other pinball video games. We've seen a few pinball games for the Famicom, starting with Nintendo's own Pinball from 1984, a cute but basic little game, and Coconut Super Pinball, which came out the month before Alien Crush. Comparing these two games to Alien Crush dramatically demonstrates the huge difference between the Famicom and the PC Engine's graphical capabilities. Naturally, Alien Crush has various little bonus stages, though they all take place on the same screen as far as I know. As you may have noticed, the game was published by Naxit, which means we now have a third company publishing games to the system. Naxit was a software publishing arm of Naga Electronics Company, which had partnered with NEC from time to time. The name Naxit is simply Taxon backwards, Taxon being another subsidiary of Naga. A few Famicom games were released in the US under the Taxon name, such as 8 Eyes or Fist of North Star, and even Hudson Star Soldier. They ended up becoming a major publisher for the PC Engine, so we'll certainly see more of them in Chronturbo. As for Alien Crash, despite its apparent simplicity, it's considered one of the all-time best pinball games for a console. It's just one of these games where everything lined up perfectly. Graphics, sound, playability, the pinball physics are excellent. The table has all kinds of cool moving parts, secrets, and lots of ways to get bonuses. Facehugger type aliens will crawl around on the screen, for example. This is almost like a boss level, a giant centipede. A few sequels and follow-ups would later appear, and a remake for the Wii came out not that long ago. It's odd that one of the best games for the console so far is a pinball game, but Compile and Naxit really just sort of pulled out all the stops for this one. Two genres that were absolutely unavoidable in Japan at this time were Portopia-style adventure games and military strategy games. And military strategy games finally come to the PC Engine with Gaia no Monsho. Pretty awesome intro here. Guy is riding giant birds, the guy is riding dolphins. This game looks cool. Well, as it turns out, looks can be a bit deceiving. On the main menu, you can choose to play a single battle or start the full campaign mode. An important factor here is your points. You use them to purchase units before each battle. You also get to choose a magic to use in this battle, which will give you some sort of bonus. Oh, and what we're looking at here is actually the Crest of Gaia, the unofficial English translation from D. This looks pretty darn simple. You select a unit, then move them around on the battlefield. If you're next to an enemy unit, you can attack. Some units, like crossbowmen, can perform ranged attacks. This all makes sense, right? Well, there are some things that don't make sense. Such as, when engaging in battles, there doesn't seem to be any indication of how much damage units are taking, or how much life they have left. This makes it, well, pretty darn difficult to plot out any sort of strategy. Also, the game performs some sort of random dice roll at the beginning of each turn to determine who has the next move. So you might get a couple turns in a row, or the enemy might. Again, it makes strategizing kind of difficult. Then, to make things weirder, the game either gives you points or takes away points, depending on your performance. Now, this isn't very surprising, but Gaia no Monsho was originally a computer game. Here's the PC-88 version. NCS, or Nippon Computer Systems, sort of specialize in these kind of games, since after Gaia no Monsho, they released a follow-up called Langrisser for the Genesis, which actually got a US release under the name Warsong. The Langrisser series was added a more detailed story and has sort of like an RPG style slant to it. It became pretty successful. Now, for some reason in the first battle, I ended up losing points, so I have fewer points to buy units. Oh, and by the way, your surviving units don't actually transfer over to the next battle. You need to buy all new units each battle. Thus I was pretty much outnumbered for battle number 2 from the get-go. NCS eventually released games under the name Messiah. The Cho Aniki games and the Languisher games are pretty well known, but expect to see a lot of lesser known Messiah games in future episodes of Chronturbo. And well, on the second battle, I ended up winning but lost all but one of my units. This resulted in my points dropping below 0, so I lost the game even though I won the battle. So Gaia no Monsho is an interesting game, but it has some bizarre and maybe even unfair rules that prevent it from being a really good game, and it ends up seeming more like a dry run for Languisher. Yet another third-party publisher enters the fray, Victor Musical Industries, with Makio Densetsu, the Legendary Axe, or as was known around here in the West, just the Legendary Axe. Let's not beat around the bush here. In terms of side-scrolling action platformer type games, Legendary Axe is the one when it comes to early PC Engine releases. The Kung Fu, JJ and Jeff, Keith Courage, forget about all that stuff. It certainly gets off to an exciting start. About 20 seconds into the game you fight the first mini-boss, a giant spider. Because your weapon is so weak at this point, he takes a while to kill. But check out this, as you hack away at him, pieces of his legs go flying off. It's a nice touch. Once you've killed him, he'll give you some items, including the first weapon power-up. It will add 1 gem to your axe. And as you can see, your power bar up at the top there is now filled up 1/4 of the way. From time to time you'll also find a few bonus items off the beaten path, such as here. For the most part though, Legendary Axe is a pretty straightforward and linear action game. There are no RPG elements, you just hit guys with your axe. However, for the most part, the game is very slick and well made. Notice, for example, how each enemy has a decent number of sprites. The first boss encounters with a couple of rather malicious bears. Each has a couple walking sprites, 2 attacking sprites, a sprite for falling back when hit. Everything's very well animated. It's definitely a step up from the 2 or 3 sprite animations found on enemies in most Famicom games. And here's the confusing text between levels. Flare is not the main boss, but your girlfriend, whom you're trying to rescue. Throughout most of the game, Legendary Axe keeps things pretty fresh. Each level is different than the one before, and features great detailed backgrounds. And there are also some unusual enemies, such as the gigantic rolling boulder, which will take you by surprise the first time you encounter it. Legendary Axe has a definite Castlevania feel to it, even though your axe-wielding barbarian character, Gogan, is not quite as stiff as Belmont. There are a few jumping sequences, and while Gogan's jump takes some getting used to, he's much easier to control than Rastan from Sega's game, which Legendary Axe greatly resembles. Though I wonder what sort of climate this game takes place in. On this level we have some tropical-looking plants and palm trees, with a forest of redwoods or pine trees in the background. These guys seem borrowed right out of Castlevania. There's really not much in the way of secrets here, but there are a few cool semi-hidden areas. Grabbing that key will unlock an area with a few items, including the all-important axe power-up. As for how that power-up works, well, the meter empties when you swing your axe, and then refills afterwards. It takes about a second to refill, and the strength of your attack depends on how far the meter is filled. So a series of attacks in quick succession will be relatively weak, whereas waiting a moment and then attacking will be much more powerful. The important thing is if an enemy is approaching you, better make contact with your first swing. You don't want to waste a charged up swing. By level 4 you'll be able to collect the last power-up, again guarded by a giant spider, though he does go down much faster this time. If you then hit an enemy with a fully charged up attack, the action will pause for a sec while you unleash a small explosion capable of killing regular enemies in one hit. The mechanic of having to wait to charge your attack lends a bit of a risk and reward factor to the game, especially during boss battles. So who developed Legendary Axe? Well, Victor mostly used contract developers at this time, and it appears that ICOM, the same guys who did Amagon, were responsible. In fact, ICOM basically remade Legendary Axe for Jalico the next year as the Astyanax. We'll see it turn up later on the Famicom. Some sources attribute Legendary Axe to Red and Atlas, who did the sequel, but as far as I know, they had nothing to do with the first game. Now the question arises, how did ICOM create a game this good when all we've seen from them so far has been sort of terrible? Legendary Axe features its share of fast enemies, but not to the screwed up level of Amagon. I call this inexplicable variation in quality among one publisher as the Sunsoft conundrum. Here's a Karate Kid-like bug. Not killing those guys at the bottom will prevent any enemy encounters on the top level. Normally rock-carrying gorillas break out of the walls at various points. Speaking of which, here's one now. I'm not sure why bears and gorillas are out to get you, but 2 fully charged strikes will take care of these guys. So far, Legendary Axe hasn't screwed the player around too much, but this changes in the last level, Zone 5, which is an absurdly long and repetitive series of rooms. If you know the castle level in Super Mario Bros. Where you have to take a specific path, or you end up just getting looped around into a circle, level 5 is sorta like that. Most rooms have either a well you can drop down or a door you can exit. But you have to find the correct path or you'll just go around in a circle. But unlike Super Mario Bros., this level is 26 rooms long and filled with difficult enemies, including some bosses from prior levels. When fighting these guys, it's really hard to avoid taking damage, and losing a life means your axe will drop 1 power level, and you want to be fully charged up for the last boss. And the whole thing is really an exercise in frustrating the player, an attempt to sort of stretch out the game's length. The boss at the end of Zone 5 is a little creepy looking, and it can be difficult if you don't have a fully charged up axe or you don't use the right strategy. Really what you should try to do is avoid his fireballs and only attack when he teleports. When you see him teleport, move over to where he's appearing, then hit him again with a fully charged blow. He'll go down in about 3 hits. The final boss is quite weird looking and seems to be formed from the spirits of earlier bosses. He's actually pretty damned impressive, enormously huge and well animated. Beating him is perhaps a matter of luck since he has a pretty much unavoidable leg kick, and if he decides to always jump over you, you'll probably get killed. Otherwise, you just keep pounding away at him until he sort of turns a reddish purple. So while it's not perfect, Legendary Axe definitely stands with R-Type and Alien Crush as the best and most well-remembered games from the first 2 years of the PC Engine's existence. When it was released in the US, it garnered quite a lot of praise, with Video Games and Computer Entertainment magazine awarding it the Video Game of the Year award for 1989. And of course, everyone sat around scratching their heads wondering why NEC didn't release this as the pack-in game for the TurboGrafx 16 instead of Keith Courage. I guess that was a real missed opportunity for NEC. So if you're looking for an early TurboGrafx action game, this right here is definitely the one. Things are getting a little weird here because our next game is Fantasy Zone. So right as Sega was rolling out its new console, the Mega Drive, it was licensing games for the PC Engine. Even stranger, Fantasy Zone is the first PC Engine game published by NEC themselves, under their NEC Avenue brand name. In the US, of course, virtually every TurboGrafx game ended up being published by NEC, but this was their entry into console game publication. So wow, the music is sort of awful. I'm sure you all remember Fantasy Zone, Sega's arcade game, which we've already seen for the Master System, and there was also a Famicom version by Sunsoft. One unusual feature at the time was the collecting coins from slain enemies, which could then be used in the shop. I'm upgrading the engine here, in other words, I'm getting a speed up. You can make your selections here. And now I'm going a little bit faster. I still think the best version, other than the arcade game, is the Master System one. We'll do a quick comparison. Here's the Master System version. Doesn't look as good as the PC Engine version, but it sounds better and somehow it handles better. Whereas the PC Engine had brighter colors and vertical scrolling, but just sort of feels weird. It was apparently ported by Bits Laboratory, who we've seen in Chrontendo before, most recently in episode 38 with Square's Hanjuku Hero. Graphically speaking, this is closer to the arcade game than previous releases. The Master System Fantasy Zone had you fighting bosses against blank backgrounds. Oh, and here we also get a cool animation where the boss falls to pieces after you defeat him. Defeating the boss will get you lots of coins. On the other hand, the coins look terrible and are too small. Next level is quite impressive, as some fake multiplane scrolling has been cooked up. The PC Engine couldn't technically handle multiplane scrolling, but this looks pretty convincing. Anyway, Fantasy Zone is one of the few games we've seen so far that pulls off the hat trick of appearing on all three consoles, the Famicom, the Master System, and the PC Engine. Only one game was released in November 1988, and it's from Hudson. Sadakichi 7, Hideyoshi no Ogun. Note the chef's knife used as a cursor on the title screen. In Chrontendo, I've long bemoaned this constant stream of these Japanese adventure games. I guess it's only a matter of time, but here's the first such game for the PC Engine. At least it has this silly little intro. The game is like a James Bond takeoff, sort of a goofy parody of spy novels and movies. The opening text scroll informs you of the existence of a criminal organization called NATO, which seems to sort of tie in the whole culinary theme of the game here. If you've never heard of natto, it's a dish made from fermented soybeans, and is known for its interesting aroma. We even see it tossing her hat on the hat rack, just like in James Bond. According to Magweasel's Kevin Gifford, the main theme of Sadakichi 7 is the clash between the cultures of Osaka and Tokyo, and apparently much of the game is written in heavy Osaka dialect. Aside from that, however, it seems to work just like every other such game. You mostly use the look, investigate, and talk commands. You talk to people, ask them about specific things. The game will actually make a chime sound when you do something important, like unlock a new menu option. So yeah, it's nothing we haven't seen before, just sort of a regular old Famicom adventure game with slightly better graphics. Maybe the writing is really funny, but that's probably something that's not going to be picked up with anyone who's not really into Japanese dialect humor. Alright folks, here is where the world of video games changes forever and where Chronturbo starts getting exciting. So far all the games we've seen have been released on those tiny little Hue cards, which typically held about 2 megabits or about 262 kilobytes, around the same as most Famicom cards. However, on December 4th, 1988, NEC released the first upgrade to the PC Engine, the CD-ROM system. Just like how the Famicom disk system allowed the Famicom to play games on floppy disks, the CD-ROM allowed games to be played on CD-ROMs. Yep, 6 years before the PlayStation and 5 years before Myst, Hudson and NEC started putting out games on CD-ROM. Hell, even Sega's Mega CD wouldn't come out for another 3 years. The first CD-ROM home computer game, which was a release of Cyan's The Manhole, didn't come out until 1989. It worked sort of like the Famicom disk system, except that a separate connector piece was required to hook up the PC Engine and the CD-ROM system. Also, to actually use the CD-ROM, you need to put in the CD-ROM system card into the PC Engine card slot. This contained the BIOS and an added 64K of RAM as a buffer. Later, the amount of RAM would be increased with the Super CD-ROM system. Now, aside from games, the CD-ROM could be used to play regular CDs. Pop one in and you get this interface. In 1988, not too many people even had CD players, much less CD-ROM drives in their computers, so this was way ahead of its time. So what was the advantage of the CD-ROM format? Well, a huge increase in the amount of space. A Hue card could hold around 1/4 of a megabyte. The CD-ROM could hold 500 megabytes. That's 2,000 times the available space. Wow, what would developers do with all that space? Well, music for one, no more relying on crummy sound chips. So let's start by taking a look at the 2 games that were released as launch titles on December 4th. And our first CD-ROM game is Capcom's Fighting Street, though it's actually published by Hudson and ported by Alpha Systems, a small company that will turn up quite a bit in Chronturbo. Most of Capcom's games for the console would end up being published by other companies. So we were asking what all this extra space on the CD-ROM could be used for. Well, in this case they went with pre-recorded music. Let's check it out. However, the speech is still horrible and sounds hardware-based. So Fighting Street is in fact the game also known as Street Fighter, the first Street Fighter game. Something looks screwy here, like why am I keep punching at the air? We'll discuss that in just a second. You might recall Street Fighter from the 1987 arcade roundup. The game was not a success, unlike its sequel, and no one really plays it today. But check out the arcade version's music. Yep, the PC Engine got a major music upgrade. The arcade game did have better colors, however, and more detailed backgrounds. Still, when you do a comparison between the arcade and console versions, you'll see the sprites do look pretty darn similar. So why did no one play this game? Well, because it was awful. It plays nothing like Street Fighter 2. There are only 2 characters, Ryu and Ken, and I believe they have exactly the same moves. There are no combos, you can't attack while you're jumping, or even while taking a step. It's also infamous for this: terrible speech samples. Apparently, in the interest of faithfulness to the original, it was decided to sort of take the speech directly from the arcade game, rather than re-recording it. Now, one problem here, special moves are difficult to impossible to pull off. The Hadouken is here, and so is the Hurricane Kick, but the odds of successfully executing the move are like 20 to 1. As you can see from the videos, I spent much of my time trying and failing to do Hadouken or Hurricane Kick, and ended up just punching and kicking the air. If you're lucky, I got even 1 successful attempt recorded. The arcade game is not very good, and this version is even worse. The 6 buttons have been reduced to 2 buttons, the controls are unresponsive, it doesn't feel precise the way Street Fighter 2 did. If you like the sequel, you'd probably get pissed off with Fighting Street pretty quickly. As for why they changed the name from Street Fighter to Fighting Street, no idea, unless they were just trying to avoid association with the arcade game. Still, does have great sounding music. The other CD-ROM system launch title showed a completely different direction for the new medium. Noriko, also from Hudson, falls into the not really a game category, though there are some minimal interactive elements. The disc is based around viewing pictures and recordings of Noriko Ogawa, one of those so-called idols that are popular in the Far East. She should not be confused with the other Noriko Ogawa, a classical pianist, who is much more well known in the West than the idol Noriko. While the idea of basing a game around her seems a little odd, the CD-ROM format is in fact the perfect vehicle for such a concept. As you recall, Nintendo released a Nakayama Miho video game, and this idea is similar except that we can now actually have Noriko's voice in the game. For a singer and actress, this makes perfect sense. Rather than relying on an 8-bit representation and a box of text, we can now have digitized photographs and recordings of her songs. Well, let's take a listen. Certainly, nothing like this was even remotely possible on earlier game consoles. Okay, so what's the game like? Well, the story is that you go to the Noriko concert and then go backstage to meet her, and sure enough, she's really nice and down to earth, and guess what? You get to go out on a date with her. The next major section of the game is the date. We have more digitized photos here. You have a few little menus from time to time. For example, you can choose what to do on the date. Going out to eat will result in you spinning a wheel to see what Noriko will eat. You also get to go shopping and see her try on various outfits. Really, the whole thing is just an excuse to view various adorable pictures of Noriko and listen to her talk to you. You can even make her dance. In this part, you control her by pressing the buttons on the D-pad. Turns out she dances like a goddamn spaz. Why the hell is she wearing a referee shirt throughout much of the game? You know, I keep calling this a game, but it's not really. I don't know if you can win or lose Noriko, despite the fact that after the date you get caught in the rain and ending up drinking hot chocolate at her pad. I'm pretty sure there's no way to get lucky with her. There is a trivia quiz and a game of rock, paper, scissors, so maybe there's some sort of unlockable content, but everything is completely G-rated, I'm sure. So, while Noriko seems pretty pointless and pandering by today's standards, it was unique and new in 1988. There was nothing like it because there weren't other CD-ROM games. And while the path Hudson chose with Noriko eventually led to the dead end of stuff like Crisscross Make My Video, you can't really blame them for experimenting in a new medium. So no, it's not a good game or nothing you'll probably want to play, but yes, I suppose it is a success as an experiment for the CD-ROM system. Okay, so we're back to the Hue cards here, and it's another damn Sega game. What's going on? Just like Fantasy Zone, it's published by NEC Avenue in Japan. Under the mode option, you can select which control scheme you want. You can do regular or inverted. Not too many games featured setup options at this time, but with the PC Engine, different control schemes and sound tests and that kind of thing would become more common. Space Harrier was, of course, Sega's massively popular super scalar game, which used sprite-based 3D effects. It was noted for being just about the fastest, craziest, loudest, and most extreme arcade game in existence when it came out in 1986. Consoles were not really capable of replicating a game like Space Harrier, but the PC Engine comes somewhat close. Let's do some comparisons. Here's the arcade game, very fast and smooth. Then here's the Master System version, previously seen in Chrontendo Episode 2. It's an ugly mess, but it's still amazing that they pulled this off on the Master System. And here's the PC Engine again. Well, you'll notice the checkerboard on the planet's surface is gone for some reason, but the fact that NEC's hardware could handle a bunch of sprites at once avoids all the crazy flickering of the Master System game. Also, the colors are more accurate, and it's not as slowed down as the Sega Master System version of Space Harrier. The PC Engine's sound chip can't quite replicate the voices, but they are somewhat recognizable. Also on the negative side, the explosions are much punier than the arcade games. And by the way, Space Harrier is a big game. It's the first 4 megabit card for the PC Engine. Sega themselves had released a few 4 megabit cards for the Master System, such as Phantasy Star and Afterburner, but 3 megs was still pretty much the limit for the Famicom at this point. Now it was ported to the PC Engine by Denpa Shinbunsha, who is mostly known for porting arcade games to Japanese computers and for making some hardware. I believe they released some add-ons for the PC Engine, such as like arcade-style joysticks. So all in all, it's pretty good. It's better than the Famicom game or the Master System release. Still not quite the full Space Harrier experience, and I do wonder, why was Sega so anxious to put out games on competitors' consoles? Namco returns in the middle of December with their second game this episode, Dragon Spirit, a vertical shoot-'em-up in which you control a dragon rather than the usual spaceship or airplane or something. Here we see the PC Engine's color palette was wide enough they could put a blue dragon on a blue background and still have everything easy to see. So your cute little dragon breathes fire on flying enemies and drops something on ground enemies. In other words, Dragon Spirit is very similar to Namco's Xevious. Fire and bomb have separate buttons, so you have to switch between the two. In my opinion, this works okay in arcade machines, but I think most folks use their thumbs to press button on a console controller, so it doesn't work quite as well. Aside from enemies, you'll need to bomb eggs which contain power-ups. Red eggs will increase your firepower, and blue ones will cause you to grow an extra head, which also increases your firepower. The arcade game came out in 1987, and had a cool intro which showed that your dragon was actually a transformed human being. The arcade game was a bit faster, and it had more detailed graphics, but it wasn't exactly a powerhouse in the hardware department, not compared to the newer Namco boards. Thus, the PC Engine Dragon Spirit is a pretty good recreation of the original. Some of the details are lost, the water is a flat blue color here, and the screen dimensions have been changed, but definitely it's the closest thing to the arcade game out of the various home versions. Though near the end of the game levels were changed or dropped. I assume that the HuCard size limitations were the cause of some of the missing content, such as the intro. Other power-ups do appear from time to time, usually dropped by special flashing enemies. These are cool, but they have limited use, and they tend to disappear when you really need them. The thing is, personally, I don't really like Dragon Spirit. The backgrounds seem kind of dull in places, and the enemies tend to be small and unimpressive looking. I don't really like the 2-button control for air and ground enemies, but most of all the game is a bit tedious and a pain to play. Your dragon is pretty damned large, especially when powered up with multiple heads. Ground enemies shoot these little tiny projectiles often clustered together so close that you literally cannot squeeze between them. It's really easy to get boxed in by flying enemies, projectiles, and ground hazards like the volcanoes here. And Dragon Spirit isn't like one of those modern shoot-'em-ups where you have a little teeny tiny hitbox. Nope, if anything touches even the tip of your wing, blam, you're dead. What this means is that memorization is required to know where the enemies will appear so you can position yourself and blast them before they start shooting projectiles. On top of this, you throw in a checkpoint system and the fact that you lose all your power-ups when you die, you have sort of an infuriating game. Some bosses can be next to impossible without being powered up. This guy, for example. If you die before reaching him, you probably won't have enough firepower to clear out all his screen-filling projectiles. Here, since I have the 3 heads, I can just shoot them away, but if you're back to the single head, boy, you're not going to be able to shoot more than a couple of those things before they hit you. So Dragon Spirit is a game I really wanted to like, but just couldn't. Later on, however, we'll see a completely new version for the Famicom and a much better sequel for the PC Engine. Alright, we have another one from Hudson here, Apare Gate Ball. Or perhaps it's better pronounced Apare Gata Ball. It's one of the very few video games devoted to Gate Ball, which is a Japanese variation on croquet. One rather handy option you'll find in the menu is a rather detailed explanation of how to play Gate Ball. In-game instructions were pretty unusual in console games back then. I don't think Gate Ball is too terribly popular, so unlike baseball or golf, not everybody knows the rules. So the first thing to do is pick your team. You've got a number of colorful characters, each with their own stats. I'm not sure if they represent the real-life spectrum of Gate Ball players, as I think it's mostly played by old folks. Gate Ball is a team sport, and the object is to get the balls through 3 gates, in the correct order and direction. players from each team take turns. The control mechanic is almost taken directly from contemporary golf games. You control first of all the direction you want to hit the ball, and then you have the typical power meter, though in this case the object is simply to hit the button right when the meter reaches the arrow. Unlike golf, you're not simply trying to get the ball in the general direction of the green, you're trying to get it through a very small hoop. This means you must stop the meter precisely on the arrow. Even a little bit off will cause a miss. If you're successful in getting a ball through a gate, you'll actually get another turn and keep on doing so until you miss. Like croquet, if you hit another ball, you can then place your ball next to it and then knock the opponent's ball out of bounds. Or if you hit a teammate's ball, you can knock their ball to a better location. In fact, gate ball seems more to involve shooting other balls around rather than actually trying to get through a hoop. Now it seems reasonably fun, though the CPU hardly ever gets a bad shot in or misses its target, so it can get a bit frustrating. One thing that's not very clear is who developed this game. Some Japanese sources say it was by Westone, the same guys who did the Wonder Boys games. By the way, I've been calling them West One, but someone says the pronunciation is not correct. Of course, when you're dealing with a Japanese company that has a made-up English name, it's hard to say what the correct pronunciation is, but it turns out it's a portmanteau of West and Stone, so Westone seems logical. Like I was saying, they're often listed as the developers, but then there's also this mysterious company called Azuma in the credits. Are they the co-developer? Or are they maybe the artist who did the character portraits? I don't know, it's a mystery to me. Well, anyway, the final conclusion is that Appare Gateball is not a bad little game. If you like sports games based on obscure sports that you've never played in real life, then you might want to check this out. But it's definitely no Super Dodgeball. (1988) closes out with the third CD-ROM title, Bikuriman Daijikai, the second game from Hudson, based on the series of collectible cards. As you recall from Chronturbo 1, Hudson took Wonder Boy and Monsterland, changed the sprites, and released it as Bikuriman World. This game has some wild music, and much like Noriko, a good amount of recorded speech. If it seems weird that Hudson released another Bikuriman title so quickly, keep in mind that Bikuriman was incredibly popular in Japan at this time. So on the main screen here we have a few different selections. There's these different levels, but 3 out of 4 are locked, so we'll have to start with the first one. Now don't be disappointed, but if you're expecting something like Bikuriman World, well, it's nothing like that. In fact, much like Noriko, it's not really a game. It's almost more of a database. As I mentioned, Bikuriman was a series of collectible cards, and this disc is basically a card database. It's sort of like a Bikuriman encyclopedia. You can scroll through the cards and look at the details of each character. This does sound pretty boring, but there are a few interactive elements. You can only view a handful of cards at first, then a quiz section will pop up and you need to answer a question about Bikuriman. If you get it correct, you'll unlock a special Bikuriman character called a head and another series of cards. Wow, that little angel chick is really happy that I got the answer right. And again, some pretty wacky music. And as far as I'm aware, this is pretty much how the entire disc goes. You're just unlocking more cards and eventually the other areas we saw on the main screen. But there is a bit more. For example, you can also unlock these animated cutscenes, and you can view them here. So technically there's a lot of content on this disc. Many dozens of characters, each with their own illustration and stats, lots of animated cutscenes. The non-music part of the disc comes to over 40 megabytes of data, with the entire disc being around 300 megabytes. That was another really great thing about the CD-ROM format. You could cram tons of graphics and text onto it. There was no more struggling to fit everything onto a 2 megabit card. Much like Noriko, Bakuriman Daijikai is not a disc you'd want to play nowadays, but it is in some ways still a bit of a landmark title. Wow, so there you go. We've got through the first year and a half of the new console. All told, there were 22 games released for the relatively new PC Engine in 1988. However, 1989 is going to be the year that things really pick up quite a bit. So Chronturbo Episode 3 will be a full 15 games, just like Chrontendo. What's going to happen next time? Well, more new publishers for one. Also, for the first time, the majority of games will not be from Hudson. We'll also see some arcade ports, an RPG, shoot-em-ups, sports games, and a classic military strategy game. So after a few more episodes of Chrontendo, join us for Chronturbo number 3.